5 years after leaving Duke Alexander Hawthorne, waiting at the altar, before half the kingdom, Duchess Eleanor Whitmore returned to his estate with nothing but a ruined name, a rain-soaked cloak, and one desperate request. The storm had swallowed Hawthorne Manor in darkness when her battered carriage stopped at the gates. Eleanor stepped down slowly, trembling beneath the rain. The diamonds that once announced her rank were gone. Her gloves were torn. Even the guards stared before one finally recognized the woman whose disappearance had become one of society's most infamous scandals. Inside, Alexander was entertaining distinguished guests when word reached him that Eleanor Whitmore was standing at his door. He came down himself. For the first time in 5 years, they stood face to face. Eleanor told him she knew she had no right to ask anything of him, but she had nowhere else to go. Alexander's expression barely changed. 5 years earlier, he reminded her, she had somewhere to go. She had simply chosen it over him. Eleanor swallowed hard. Then she told him the one thing he had never expected to hear. She had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she believed marrying him would destroy him. And to understand why, they would have to return to the days before the wedding. 5 years earlier, Duke Alexander Hawthorne had been a very different man. He was already wealthy, admired, and considered one of the most desirable bachelors in the kingdom, but none of that mattered to him when Eleanor Whitmore entered a room. Their engagement had not been arranged to secure land or strengthen some political alliance. They had chosen each other, and everyone around them knew it. Alexander had even ignored quiet pressure from members of his family who believed he should marry a woman with greater wealth and stronger connections to the crown. Eleanor knew about those whispers and sometimes teased him that half the aristocracy seemed to be waiting for their marriage to collapse before it even began. Alexander never appeared worried. As far as he was concerned, they would simply disappoint them altogether. For months, Hawthorne Manor had been transformed in preparation for the wedding. Flowers arrived by carriage. Tailors worked late into the evening. Invitations had reached noble families across the kingdom. By the final week, there seemed to be only one thing anyone wanted to talk about: the wedding of Duke Alexander Hawthorne and Duchess Eleanor Whitmore. But 3 days before the ceremony, everything changed. A sealed packet was delivered privately to Eleanor. There was no name on the outside. Inside were financial records, letters, and copies of transactions connected to the Hawthorne estate. At first, Eleanor barely understood what she was seeing. Then she saw Alexander's name. The documents appeared to show that enormous sums had been borrowed against Hawthorne lands. Several estates seemed dangerously close to financial collapse. One letter claimed that Eleanor's late father had discovered the problem shortly before his death, and at the bottom of the final document was what appeared to be Alexander's signature. The accusation was simple and devastating. Alexander was supposedly drowning in debt, and their marriage would give him access to Eleanor's inheritance and the Whitmore estates. She refused to believe it. Alexander had never spoken to her about financial trouble, but that alone was not enough to make her doubt him. So Eleanor went to the one man she believed would know the truth: Lord Victor Hawthorne. Alexander's uncle had advised the family for years. He had helped manage estates, negotiated contracts, and stood beside Alexander after the death of his father. When Eleanor showed him the papers, Victor reacted with exactly the right amount of hesitation. He did not immediately condemn Alexander. Instead, he behaved like a man being forced to reveal something painful. He told Eleanor that Alexander had been hiding serious financial problems. He claimed the Duke had become desperate and that exposing the truth before the wedding could create a scandal large enough to destroy both families. Then Victor gave her a warning she would remember for years. Sometimes, he told her, loving a man meant knowing when not to stand beside him. From that moment, Eleanor began watching Alexander differently. Every private conversation suddenly seemed to hide another meaning. Every mention of their future made her wonder what he was keeping from her. Alexander noticed the change. He could see that something was frightening her, and more than once he tried to understand why. Eleanor nearly told him everything, but fear stopped her. Victor had convinced her that if Alexander knew the documents existed, the scandal might erupt before anything could be contained. Then, on the night before the wedding, another message arrived. It contained only a few lines. If Eleanor married Alexander the following morning, copies of the financial records would be delivered directly to the crown. By sunrise, she believed she had been given only two choices: leave the man she loved, or stay beside him and destroy him. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath clear skies, with no hint of the disaster that was already unfolding. By 11 o'clock, the cathedral was filled with some of the most powerful families in the kingdom. Noblemen crowded the front pews, ladies whispered behind jeweled fans, and every eye eventually turned toward the great doors at the back. Alexander stood at the altar waiting. At first, no one thought anything of the delay. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The music stopped and started again. Servants moved nervously between the cathedral doors. The first whispers began spreading through the pews. Alexander refused to listen to them. Something must have happened on the road. A carriage wheel could have broken. Eleanor might have been delayed at Whitmore House. Whatever the reason, he was certain she would come. But Eleanor's carriage never appeared. Instead, a lone messenger entered the cathedral. In his hand was a small envelope. Inside it lay Eleanor's wedding ring and a letter addressed only to Alexander. He read it away from the watching guests. Eleanor told him she could not marry him. She begged him not to search for her and offered no explanation he could understand. Her final words cut deepest of all. She knew he would hate her that day. She only hoped that one day he would understand why she had needed him to. Alexander read the letter twice, then a third time, but understanding never came. He returned to the cathedral alone. By evening, the abandoned wedding had become the greatest scandal of the season. The Duchess, who had been expected to become Alexander Hawthorne's wife, had vanished without explanation, leaving one of the kingdom's most powerful men standing before an altar while hundreds watched his humiliation. For several days, Alexander still refused to believe the worst. Then news arrived from the coast. Eleanor had left England with Marquis Julian Beaumont. Beaumont was wealthy, well-connected abroad, and, most painfully of all, a man who had once openly pursued Eleanor before her engagement to Alexander. That was enough. Whatever questions Alexander still carried were buried beneath one brutal conclusion. Eleanor had not been afraid. She had chosen another man. Within days, her portrait disappeared from Hawthorne Manor. Her letters were locked away. Her name was no longer spoken in Alexander's presence. Society expected the Duke to collapse beneath the humiliation. Instead, he changed. The warmth people once associated with him slowly disappeared. He threw himself into the Hawthorne estates, cutting waste, reclaiming neglected properties, and forcing failing investments back into profit. Men who once laughed about the abandoned bride soon learned not to laugh where Alexander could hear them. Year by year, the pity vanished. In its place came respect, and eventually, fear. But across the sea, Eleanor's life was nothing like the romantic escape everyone imagined. She had indeed left England with Beaumont, but she had never loved him. Beaumont had approached her after the final threat and promised that if she disappeared completely, the documents against Alexander would never reach the crown. Terrified that the man she loved would lose his title, his estates, and perhaps his freedom, Eleanor accepted the bargain. She believed she was sacrificing herself to protect him. Only after leaving England did she begin to understand how completely she had trapped herself. Beaumont gained control over much of her money. Her movements became restricted. Letters she wrote to Alexander disappeared without reply. At first, Eleanor wrote constantly, then less often. Eventually, Beaumont told her what 5 years of silence would make painfully believable. The Duke wanted nothing to do with her, so Eleanor stopped writing. 3 years after the wedding, that never happened, Beaumont died suddenly after a short illness. Eleanor expected his death to bring freedom. Instead, it revealed another disaster. Almost everything she owned was gone. Her accounts had been drained. Whitmore properties had been mortgaged without her understanding the full extent of it. Debts appeared from places she had never known existed. The woman who had once possessed wealth, rank, and a celebrated future returned to England almost penniless. Still, she did not go to Alexander. Shame kept her away. For 2 more years, she lived quietly, selling what little remained and searching through old Whitmore records, trying to understand how her life had been dismantled. Then one evening, while examining a ledger that had belonged to her father, Eleanor noticed something. A handwritten notation beside an old Hawthorne transaction. She had seen that handwriting before. Her heart stopped. It matched the writing attached to one of the financial documents that had frightened her into leaving Alexander 5 years earlier. And it did not belong to the Duke. It belonged to his uncle, Lord Victor Hawthorne. For the first time, Eleanor understood that she might never have been saving Alexander at all. Someone had wanted her to leave him, and whoever had done it had succeeded perfectly. 5 years later, Eleanor Whitmore stood once more beneath the roof of Hawthorne Manor. Alexander allowed her inside, only because the storm outside had become too violent to send anyone back onto the road. Rain hammered against the windows, wind shook the trees surrounding the estate, and for a few uncomfortable moments, the two simply stood in the entrance hall, looking at everything 5 years had changed. For Eleanor, the greatest change was Alexander himself. The man she remembered had smiled easily. He had once crossed crowded rooms simply because he had noticed her standing alone. Now there was a cold restraint about him, as though every emotion had been carefully locked somewhere no one could reach. And Hawthorne Manor had changed with him. The estate was thriving. The financial ruin Eleanor had once feared had never happened. Alexander had become wealthier, more influential, and far more powerful than the young Duke she had abandoned. Then Eleanor noticed Lady Catherine Ashford among his guests. Catherine was everything society expected Alexander's future wife to be: beautiful, composed, respected, and untouched by scandal. Rumors had already begun predicting their engagement. For the first time since returning, Eleanor wondered whether discovering the truth had simply come too late. Alexander, meanwhile, believed he understood exactly why she was there. Beaumont was dead. Whitmore House was being sold. Eleanor's fortune had disappeared. So when she finally admitted that she needed him, Alexander heard desperation rather than danger. To him, she did not need the man she had once loved. She needed what the Duke of Hawthorne now possessed: his wealth, his protection, his name. Eleanor could hardly blame him for believing it, but when Alexander offered financial assistance, she refused. She had not crossed the country to ask him for money. What she wanted was far stranger. She asked him to place her under his protection for 7 days. At the end of those 7 days, if he still wanted her gone, she would leave Hawthorne Manor and never return. Alexander was ready to refuse. Then Eleanor removed an old document from inside her cloak. It was one of the papers she had received before their wedding. She placed it before him and drew his attention to a handwritten notation beside one of the transactions. Alexander's expression changed almost immediately. He knew that handwriting. Lord Victor Hawthorne had written that way for decades. Still, Alexander revealed nothing when he saw his uncle later that evening. He merely mentioned that Eleanor had returned with questions about old Hawthorne finances. Victor remained outwardly calm, but Eleanor's presence had already frightened someone. That night, long after the manor had fallen quiet, Eleanor woke to the sound of movement inside her room. Someone was searching through her belongings. She barely had time to move before the intruder fled through the corridor. By the time servants arrived, the room had been disturbed, and the drawer where Eleanor had hidden the documents had been forced open. Nothing valuable had been taken. Only the papers had been searched for. That changed everything. Alexander could no longer dismiss Eleanor as a ruined woman, returning to the man she had once rejected. Someone inside Hawthorne Manor was afraid of what she knew. For her safety, he moved her from the isolated guest rooms into the occupied wing of the house. Being near each other again only made the past harder to ignore. There were moments when Eleanor caught something familiar in his expression, or when Alexander seemed to forget for an instant that 5 bitter years stood between them. But neither mistook those moments for forgiveness. Alexander made it clear that whatever Eleanor had discovered did not erase what she had done to him. And Eleanor did not ask him to erase it. She had come seeking protection and the truth, not a pardon she had not earned. While the manor slept, Alexander began examining financial records from the months before their wedding. At first, he expected to find nothing. Instead, he found missing money. Large sums had truly vanished from Hawthorne accounts. The fraud had been real, but the signatures authorizing those transfers were not. Someone had used Alexander's name, and the deeper he followed the records, the more often one name appeared behind them: Lord Victor Hawthorne, the uncle Alexander had trusted almost his entire life. By the following evening, Alexander had seen enough of the old Hawthorne accounts to know that Eleanor had not imagined the danger surrounding their wedding. Money had vanished, his name had been used, and for 5 years, someone had counted on both of them, never comparing what they knew. Alexander found Eleanor alone in the library and asked her for everything she had never told him. This time, she held nothing back. She told him about the first packet delivered 3 days before their wedding, the financial records bearing his signature, and the warning that her father had uncovered evidence capable of destroying the Hawthorne name. She told him how Victor had confirmed just enough of the story to make the documents believable. Then, she showed Alexander the final letter she had kept hidden all those years. The paper was worn along its folds, but the threat remained clear. If Eleanor became Alexander's wife, copies of the financial evidence would be delivered to the crown. 5 years earlier, she had believed she was choosing between her own happiness and Alexander's survival. Now Alexander finally understood why she had disappeared. But understanding was not forgiveness. there was still one question he could not ignore. Why had she not trusted him enough to tell him? Eleanor had spent 5 years asking herself the same thing. She admitted that fear had become stronger than trust. She had convinced herself there was no time to question what she had been shown. She believed that if she confronted Alexander and the evidence became public, she might destroy the very man she was trying to protect. So she made the decision alone. And in trying to save him, she had destroyed them both. Alexander might have remained angry if Eleanor had tried to excuse herself. She did not. Then he revealed something that left her speechless. Not one of her letters had ever reached him. Eleanor stared at him. She had written dozens after leaving England. At first, nearly every week, she had explained pieces of what had happened, begged him to believe that she had not left because of Beaumont, and eventually asked only for some sign that he had read her words. Alexander had received nothing. For years, Eleanor had believed his silence meant hatred. For years, Alexander had believed her silence meant indifference. Someone had made certain each of them believed the other had chosen to let go. The final pieces emerged from the financial records. Alexander discovered payments connecting Julian Beaumont directly to Victor. Money had moved from hidden Hawthorne accounts into companies controlled by Beaumont long before Eleanor ever left England with him. Beaumont had never rescued her. He had been part of the plan. And Eleanor's father had been far closer to the truth than either of them realized. Before his death, he had discovered that Victor was quietly stealing from Hawthorne Holdings. If Eleanor married Alexander, she would gain access to records that could expose the missing money. Victor needed her away from Hawthorne Manor, so he built his deception around something real. The debts existed. The missing money existed. The suspicious transactions existed. Only the identity of the thief had been changed. Victor had forged Alexander's signature, made Eleanor believe the Duke intended to use her fortune to rescue himself, threatened her with royal investigation, and placed Beaumont beside her as the only apparent escape. Then he intercepted her letters and allowed Alexander to believe she had abandoned him for another man. The betrayal that had shaped 5 years of their lives had been carefully manufactured. But even after learning the truth, Alexander did not pretend Eleanor had no responsibility. Victor had deceived her. Yet she had still chosen fear over trusting the man she intended to marry. Eleanor accepted that without protest. She had not returned because she deserved another chance. She had returned because Alexander deserved to know the truth. For the first time since she had arrived, something in him softened, not enough to erase 5 years, but enough to make forgiveness possible. They never had the chance to speak further. Elsewhere in Hawthorne Manor, Victor had realized the investigation was closing around him. Before dawn, servants discovered his rooms nearly empty. Several estate ledgers were missing, and a carriage was already being prepared at the rear entrance. Victor was trying to flee. Alexander reached the courtyard before the horses could leave. 5 years after Victor had torn their lives apart without ever raising his voice, the man responsible was finally standing before the Duke with nowhere left to hide. Victor's attempt to escape ended before the carriage ever reached the gates. Alexander had him brought back inside Hawthorne Manor, but there was no dramatic struggle and no need for threats. By then, the evidence was stronger than anything Victor could deny. Before several trusted witnesses, Alexander laid out the old financial ledgers showing money disappearing from Hawthorne accounts. Eleanor produced the letter that had threatened her on the eve of their wedding, and when a former estate clerk was summoned, he confirmed that Victor himself had ordered secret payments to Julian Beaumont. Victor tried to dismiss each accusation separately. Together, they destroyed him. The forged signatures, the stolen money, Beaumont's payments, and the threats against Eleanor all led back to the same man. By the end of the day, Victor had been stripped of every position he held within the Hawthorne estate and handed over to the authorities to answer for fraud and forgery. For Alexander, justice should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it left him facing something much harder. Eleanor. 7 days after arriving at Hawthorne Manor, she quietly packed the few belongings she had brought with her. She had kept her promise. Alexander found her preparing to leave. Eleanor thanked him for exposing Victor and, more importantly, for clearing her father's name. For years, she had lived believing her father's final discoveries had somehow contributed to Alexander's ruin. Now she knew he had simply come too close to exposing the truth. But Eleanor did not ask Alexander to forgive her, and she did not ask again to become his duchess. Some mistakes, she had finally learned, could not be undone simply because the truth had arrived late. Alexander asked where she intended to go. She told him she would find somewhere small, sell whatever remained to her, and rebuild her life from there. Then he reminded her of the night she had arrived during the storm. She had stood before him with nothing and begged him to take her back. Eleanor lowered her eyes. She had been desperate then. Alexander waited before asking the question that mattered. And now, Eleanor looked at him. Now she loved him enough not to ask. For 5 years, Alexander had convinced himself that he hated her. Hatred had been easier. It had been easier than admitting that some part of him had continued loving the woman who had humiliated him before the entire kingdom. But if they tried again, he told her, they could not return to what they had been. That version of them was gone. They would begin again. No hidden letters, no decisions made in the name of protecting the other without their knowledge, no fear disguised as sacrifice, and no pride allowed to speak where honesty should have been. Eleanor agreed. Months later, carriages once again gathered outside the cathedral, where Alexander Hawthorne had once waited alone. Many of the same families returned. Many remembered the scandal. But this time, when Alexander stood before the altar, the great doors opened exactly when they were supposed to. Eleanor appeared. She walked slowly toward him, not as the wealthy woman she had once been, but as someone who finally understood the price of mistrust. When she reached Alexander, he looked at her and quietly reminded her of the simplest truth of all. She had come, and this time, Eleanor knew there was nothing that could make her leave. They married, not because the previous 5 years had disappeared, but because both of them finally understood what had destroyed them. Eleanor had returned to Hawthorne Manor believing poverty was the worst thing she had lost. But fortunes could be rebuilt. Reputations could recover. What she had truly lost was the man she should have trusted when she still had the chance. And somehow, after everything, Alexander was willing to give her another one. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, lost love, and an unexpected second chance, subscribe for more unforgettable royal stories. And tell me in the comments, if you were the Duke, would you have taken Eleanor back after 5 years? Or would what she did at the altar have been impossible to forgive?